Okay, welcome to the very first of our drop-in shoots. Looks like there are 14 odd of you there. Welcome. How these work usually the best is if you can turn your microphones off if you're not talking, just because, as we can hear now, there's a bit of background noise, etc. I'm using software I probably shouldn't be using. Apparently Collaborate Ultra works really quite well now, but when I started trying to do these a couple of years ago, it was pretty crappy. And I use this software in my consulting business, so I'm making it easy on myself. But it should be relative. One of the reasons I chose this for my consulting business is it's usually pretty easy for people to find where things are and what to do. You can, by the way, send chat messages to me and to each other. Usually the best way to try and get my attention is to turn your microphone on and call out. I have very many times noticed a message in the chat towards the end, and that's just because I'm engaged in what I'm doing and not reading notes. I'm very happy for you to pass notes to each other if that's the way you want to roll, and yeah, I won't look at them unless you bring them to my attention, and I'm pretty sure you can do it without me even knowing they're there, actually. So what are we going to do today? Basically, these tutes have always historically been very much driven by you. I'm always prepared to do something. If you don't have questions, comments, or a discussion that we need to take it on, by this time of the week, you should be pretty well on top of the materials that we were looking at for this week. I have also given you a bit of a quiz to do. There is a discussion board question which is actually an accessible task for those of you who are in OUA, but I will give feedback on for anybody who does them anyway in the face-to-face environment, provided you get them in before the due date. Then I'll probably lock them down so that you can't keep adding to them later, because it just gets too hard to manage otherwise. So there's been a quiz which a few people did. Looks like about 6 or 7 people did the quiz. I haven't looked at how many people have done the discussion board more recently, but it was only 1 or 2 people from either group earlier on today. And I also had a reflective piece, so I can drive from that. But why don't I just open the floor at the very beginning? Is there any pressing question, pressing issue that anybody wants to raise?
I don't think it's pressing, but just an understanding of what the upcoming assignment might entail.
Sorry, I'm going to mute your audio, Karen, just because that was making it a bit noisy. I'm going to do that for Nick as well, and then I'm going to ask Lily to just say that again. Sorry. I heard what something entailed.
Not pressing, but what the upcoming assignment will entail.
Okay. Again, yes, you're right. That's not pressing, and you will know more about it in the middle of this week. And I will talk about that in this week's class as well. So I won't get too caught up here. One of the reasons for that is I haven't written that problem yet. That's one of the things I'll be doing later tonight and probably tomorrow. One of the reasons that you don't get it until quite late is I really want you to be focused on the broader picture rather than just what's on the test in those first few classes. So I do have to get it to you this week, though I understand that. In a broad sense, you will get a fact scenario and you will be asked to write a memorandum of advice to your boss, a lawyer. Your boss, in my class, your boss is always Dennis Denuto, who has his own practice in the suburbs in Coolaroo. And the reason I always choose Dennis is because he reminds me very much of my first boss, only marginally competent. And so you really had to make sure that you got it right. You couldn't rely on him to get the answers for you. So it will be a piece of advice, and we will spend a bit of time in class, not this coming week, but the following week, talking about how to write a memo and how that works. So for now, I'm going to ask you to hold on that. So if we can go back to content for this week, any particular questions, concerns, frustrations?
So this might not be on topic, but you just mentioned a quiz. I didn't register that we had a quiz.
So I'm doing one every week, both in class and then following up after class. Mm-hmm. So it was in the announcement. Okay. So it was actually, let me bring it up and you guys can see it, see what the results of it were. She says not being able to find it because here it is. No, that's the Kahoot quiz. All right, sorry, let me just share that screen. Here we go. So I'm hoping you can see web page with the Kahoot quiz on it. Our top 5 participants, there were only 6 participants. Was actually some pretty straightforward questions in there and some things that I thought might help us focus our attention for today. So who makes an offer, 100% correct. Similarly, defining what consensus ad idem was. This question, a number of people got wrong. Now, by the way, I can't see from this and I'm not showing you who got things right or wrong. This helps me just guide where to look at the attention. I'm thinking a reasonable number of people got this question wrong. So the question was an executory, that was in bold, hence the funny characters. I don't know why they show up on the website. An executory contract is a contract that has not been fully performed, true or false. I am assuming that one of the reasons why more people got that wrong than right is if you were guessing, you might have thought the picture of a signature was a hint and associated the word executory with executed. Here, executory means that it is, a contract is executed when it's fully performed, and it's executory or executory, I should say. Sorry, it's a terrible word to say. Executory when it's yet to be performed. So in a bilateral contract, or even for that matter, a unilateral contract, when there are parties who are yet to do something, then the contract itself hasn't been performed. It's still in existence. What else is this? Most of these, there were just a couple towards the end that I thought need a little bit further explanation. So McRobinson's airline is a good one. So that was not a case we talked about in class, but it is a case that I put a case study up on video as well, as I'm sort of grappling with these shorter class times. And that did come up for a couple of people in the reflection as well, that they felt there wasn't enough time in class. But I think there is enough time in class. What you'll be finding is, what you will be finding is that aeroplane mode, it can't happen again, sorry about that. What you'll be finding is there are lots of different resources which are panned for different types of learners. So you'll find that there are a number of videos. Interestingly enough, it's the earlier ones where we used to spend more time on case studies in class and less time on activities. With this new flip around, I'm still playing a bit of catch up to get some of the early ones out. So the next lot, for example, will probably only come out on Tuesday as well. So sorry, I'm rabbiting on here. McRobinson's, actually, does anybody want to just share, has anybody read McRobinson's, got a sense of it? It's quite a difficult case. Anybody want to hazard an approach at what McRobinson's was about?
I remember.
Was it about the situation with tickets and whether tickets actually are offers or not, and at what point might a ticket become an offer?
Absolutely.
And do terms and agreements actually...
so the nub of the question went to, and look, it's a really frustrating case because the judges all get to the same answer, but for different reasons. And so that's one of the reasons why that we'll throw this case early on, so that you can see how some of these really simple points can end up being really quite confusing in a whole heap of different ways. And it's Chief Justice Barwick's decision that we tend to come back to for the points of law, because of the consistency that they have with other points in future ticket cases. You will look at a lot of ticket cases. By the time fundamentals of contract law is over, you won't want to park your car in a parking garage anywhere. You will not want to leave any item, goods, or at a locker service, or anywhere where they look after your bags and hats. And you probably will caution anybody against taking a trip on a cruise liner. So there's lots of ticket cases, and largely we look at them mostly in the second half of the semester, particularly when we look at disclaimers, so when things go wrong. But in this particular ticket case, the question went to, was the ticket itself, was it evidence of the contract? At what point in time was the contract made? Was it before or after the ticket was issued? And were the terms on the ticket part of the contract, or were they something else? And it was particularly confusing because the ticket itself had a very onerous disclaimer or limiting clause on it, which effectively meant that the airline didn't have to take the passenger at all if they didn't want to. And the reason that the case came to court in the first place was not that anybody was suing for a breach of contract, but because we have a tax department trying to work out whether they can attach a tax, in this case stamp duty, to this particular ticket. So the question was, when and where is this contract made, if a contract is made at all? So with this particular question, I'm going to have to, I wonder if I can make it bigger. Oh, did that make it bigger for you?
Oh yeah, that's good.
Oh, ace, because my old eyes can't cope. So the question that I effectively gave you here, look, and Kahoot's a bit limited in how many words I can put in, so I end up just writing a slide and working it that way. So I was asking you, which of the following statements was a reason that Chief Justice Barwick gave in coming to the conclusion that that the ticket contained the terms of the offer, not the terms of the agreement itself. So it was an offer only. And that the agreement was only made subsequently when the passenger was actually on the plane. So it was, the agreement was only created at the time that the airline let the passenger on the plane. And so there was a little bit of confusion around this, and it's a difficult case because you have to actually go and have a look at the case itself. Remembering too, we don't have multiple choice questions in exams. And the very nature of a Kahoot means it's kind of yelling at you to give you a quick answer, and it could be tempting you to rely on your memory as opposed to getting out the book and actually having a look at the judgment. And I guess it's the nature of that kind of quiz that does that. So the options here were that there wasn't a contractual obligation between the airline and the purchaser until the purchaser got a seat on the plane. The ticket constituted an offer which the purchaser could accept or reject having had time to read the terms. The lack of any obligation imposed on the airline by the ticket prevented the ticket representing an enforceable agreement, or the ticket was very dissimilar to a unilateral contract. So let's work backwards from here. We already know that the court held unanimously that the ticket contained the terms of an offer, not the terms of an agreement. So part of what you're practicing here is that precision language. So just looking backwards at answer D, I don't even know what that means. It doesn't seem to relate in any way to the question. I would suggest that that's something you can just get rid of straight away. Like, you know, when your answer's there not relating to the question, I would just get rid of it. The lack of any obligation imposed on the airline ticket prevented the ticket representing an enforceable agreement. That in part, that was really sat behind Justice Stevens' argument as to why it couldn't be formed as part of an agreement. But it doesn't go to that question of whether the offer could subsequently be accepted by the ticket purchaser's conduct. It goes to the conduct of the airline itself. B, the ticket constituted an offer which the purchaser could accept or reject having had time to read the terms. Wasn't part of Barwick's judgment. Sorry. One day I'm going to have a day where people are not just trying to get messages at me all the time. So ultimately the answer was A. There were no contractual obligations between the airline and the purchaser until the purchaser got a seat on the plane. And part of that question was really just matching the answer to the nature of the question itself. But I did notice that looking at it, a large number of people who did this selected B. And that really came from the third judgment, not Barwick, not Stephen, but the other one. Can't remember who it even is at the moment. Good to see some of you are taking a little bit more time to answer these questions too. Puffs, it's very happy to see that most of you understand what a puff is. This one was a little bit of a tricky one. What's the authority for the proposition display of goods in a shop window isn't an offer? It's a very precise one. Boots Cash Chemist is really the seminal authority, but it related not to goods in a window, but goods on shelves. So Fisher and Bell is the case that related to goods in a window. I threw this Crown and the second Crown and Clark question in here because I had some feedback. Oh God, excuse me, I've got to remember to turn Facebook alerts off. I never even see them the rest of the day. And they're coming through tonight. I put this question in here because I thought I would lace some of these with some questions about citations and using AGLC 4 just to help you focus on how to do that. So the question here was, which of the following is not correct in relation to the Crown and Clark? Sorry? Somebody's about to ask me something? No? So the question here, but the one that was incorrect was this reference to, not around. Sorry, this one. Okay, it's not volume 1927, it was the year 1927 for the reporting. Sorry, I do not know why that's doing that. And I'm just going to mute this person here for a second too, so I can hear myself think. All right, so just looking at this, unfortunately, because of the nature of the way that this works, you can't see that Crown and Clark here was in italics. You'll often see cases involving the Crown cited with an R for Regina as in Queen or Rex as in King, but we still say the Crown even when we see the R. I think you're probably starting to get used to, we see this V for versus, but we don't say versus, we say and. And then the year, so that's the year of reporting. 40 is the volume. CLR is Commonwealth Law Reports, and the page number is the first page of the reporting. Anything else that really stood out here? Now, we didn't talk about this in class at all, and we will get on to, hopefully a bit later this evening, onto some electronic communications issues. But the important thing to remember about electronic communications is actually the rules. Even though there is a piece of legislation that solidifies all of these rules, they are actually exactly the same. So the rules work exactly the same way. When we talk about the postal acceptance rule, which we will talk about next week or tomorrow, in fact, the postal acceptance rule is actually an exception to the standard rule. And the standard rule is that a communication is received or becomes active at the point in time when it is received. The postal exception is that a communication that's put in the post is deemed to be accepted at the time that it's posted. But electronic communications work the same way as the standard communications work.
Why is that? Is that because there's a date on the post? It's stamped? So there's a record?
The why is it's largely historical. And I think that the idea is, or was, that at the point in time where you put a communication in the post, it was out of your hands. And you can't control whether or not the other party will read it or go and collect their mail or any of those things. But once you've done everything that you can do to communicate something, then it's outside of your hands. But the key case there is one we'll look at very briefly tomorrow, Adams and Lindsell, I think is how you say the second party. And it's a very old case, and effectively that was the idea, is that at the point of time that it's outside of the communicator's hands, that it can be deemed to be sent at that point in time. And it gets a little bit tricky with electronic communications sometimes because the law actually talks about, so the Act makes it very clear that a communication is deemed to be received at the point in time where it's capable of being retrieved. So actual receipt is not relevant. The question is just whether or not you could have received it at that point in time or not.
That's challenging with, like, say the issue of a speeding fine or something. So if they have sent you a speeding fine, is that considered a contract, or is it different because it's a penalty? In terms of
speeding fines aren't generally contracts. So speeding fines are part of the public law. So depending on which legislation they come out of, interestingly enough, some parking issues have arisen over recent times where there have been private fines where effectively owners of public spaces have put up what is effectively a unilateral contract. They've put up some terms acceptable by anybody who parks on their space, and they say that a certain amount of money has to be paid, and if that money isn't paid, then an additional amount will have to be paid as some kind of fine or penalty. And those actually work under contract law, but then again subject to local government ordinance and a range of other factors as well. But having said that, the electronic communications legislation could very well apply outside of transactions. So similar ideas apply in other kind of public law circumstances. So it's a really good example of a situation where you might have to think about this kind of principle.
Yeah.
Kath, I've got a question about withdrawals sent by post.
Yeah.
In the textbook, there was a statement that was made which says no exception is made for a withdrawal sent by post. So no exception is made for a withdrawal sent by post. And I was really confused by that. Are you able to explain what that means?
And so that's in the textbook?
Yeah, page 67.
Context. I suspect what they're saying is that there is a, actually you've got the page number?
Page 67, last sentence.
Sorry, I just want to make sure I'm reading it in context because...
Yeah, so page 67 and the last sentence of paragraph 3.
Page 67. Okay. That all makes sense. It makes sense to me. That's all right. Just make sure we're on the same page. So the postal acceptance rule is an exception to the general rule. So the general rule is you have to communicate something. So communication only occurs when it's actually communicated. So the postal acceptance rule is an exception from that rule, which means if you're going to accept an offer in the post, your acceptance becomes effective or is deemed to be effective at the point in time when you put it in the post. But the exception doesn't apply if you are withdrawing an offer. So then the standard rule will apply. If you're going to withdraw an offer, you can't just put your withdrawal in the post and deem it to be withdrawn from the point of time that you posted it. The standard rule applies, which is when you have to communicate it. In reality, this stuff is very rarely an issue. These are the rules that apply in the absence of the parties setting up some other mechanism. So if I were to make you an offer to sell you this amazing button that says all the time, and I was offer that to you, and you can have this for $1 million, and I'm going to specify that the way that you have to communicate your acceptance is by sending me a handwritten letter, then I could reject, if you were to send me an email or make a telephone call or jump up and down right now on the screen and tell me, yes, yes, yes. Yes, 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 yes. You are very, very happy to buy this from me for $1 million. I could reject all of those offers or all of those responses because I had specified that the only way you can accept this offer is to write me a letter, a handwritten letter. As a consequence of me setting up that the way that I'm making the offer and the way that I'm communicating with you, it might be that a court would say it is reasonable for me to communicate a withdrawal of that offer by post as well. But it's more likely to say that if we haven't specified any particular way that I might withdraw it or any particular time period, then it's the time when you actually receive a communication that I've withdrawn that offer. And by the way, I love my yes button, so I don't want to sell it to you after all. But my no button has run out of batteries, so we might be able to enter into negotiations in relation to that. We don't have any mechanism specified. So it's only when those rules apply. What you will see in most contracts, so if, for example, telephone contract, a telephone contract that is in writing may well be framed as an offer from the purchaser to the vendor of those services. So you sign a contract, which is an application for you to get that service that you want, the minutes, data, whatever it happens to be. And it itself will usually contain a notices clause of some point, which will talk about the ways that you need to communicate with them and they need to communicate with you. So it might specifically say that they will not allow you to cancel your contract by telephone, that you have to do it using an online form, or that you have to do it in writing. It might also say that they can communicate with you by telephone or in writing or by email. And often these things are overridden by because actually the postal acceptance rule, quite frankly, very rarely works for anybody. So they're overridden by the terms that are included in the contract document itself. Is that helpful, Nia? That was Nia who asked that question, yeah?
Yes, thank you so much.
Let me just flick up here, see if there's anything else that... There wasn't anything that particularly worried me about this. It's a little bit hard at this early stage because often I'm asking you questions about things we haven't spoken about in class. And that will be one of the things that you will find a little bit scary and possibly frustrating about your first assignment, is it will necessarily cover some things that we haven't dealt with in class, as did the discussion group task. So what I'd like to do, if you're happy to, is to talk about the discussion group task and talk not necessarily about the answer to the problem, but how you might go about, I should say, trying to solve that problem, what kind of things you would do. Does that sound useful?
Yeah.
We're all very quiet still. So...
Yes, sounds great.
Awesome.
That's what I need. I need a little bit of...
Yahoo!
Yeah, baby. Exactly. That's what I need. Let me find where I have put it. Everything's there. Hopefully Facebook will... I feel like I am misrepresenting myself as a much more popular person than I actually really am, as Facebook's throwing messages up all the time. So what do I have here? Something that's not being... So what I have tried to do here is create a kind of whiteboard of this task. Oh, good. This form is... I get to see most of your faces now, which is excellent. So Seizure and Susanna, don't know who's had a go at this. The problem is as follows. Oh, sorry, it says screen sharing stop. Let me find the screen sharing button again. Come on. What is it doing? Exit school. See if that'll help me. No buttons are working. Ah, here it's coming. Eventually. Here we go. Main screen share. All right. So, Zita and Susanna. And my picture of the ugly cat. Don't know why we had to highlight that. Friday, 9 a.m. Susanna, who owns a pet shop, emails Zita, a customer, offering to sell her a purebred Siamese cat for 500 bucks, stating that she needs a reply within 24 hours. Zita doesn't open the email until Friday at 12 noon, so 3 hours later. Later that afternoon, Susanna sells the cat to another customer and immediately emails Zita a revocation of her offer. On Friday evening, Zita faxes Susanna a letter of acceptance, but Susanna doesn't see the fax until 8 a.m. the next morning. Zita only reads Susanna's second email at 10 o'clock on the Saturday morning. What rights does Zita have? So let's just have a quick talk about how do we address a problem like this? Where do we start?
Define the legal issue.
Define the legal issue. Okay, so let's start with, I'm assuming, is it going to let me write on here? Should. Just do that. All right, good. So find an issue, okay, I'll just write in red. So what do we think the issue is?
Whether Zita can accept Susanna's offer and purchase the cat.
So whether she can accept, could we flip that around because the cat's already been sold to somebody else, right? So
To work out whether it was actually a contract.
is there a contract? Does Zita have any rights under a contract? which, working backwards, we need to know whether she can accept that offer, because when is a contract made?
Offer and acceptance.
And they have, yeah.
When the offer is accepted. So when a valid offer, capable of acceptance without variation, is in fact accepted without variation. So when a mummy offer falls in love with the daddy acceptance and they have that beautiful intimate moment and a contract itself is conceived. Any other issues you might even go back to before that, or just things that you might like to think about before you go too far down the track?
Maybe even asking the question, was it actually an offer or just an invitation to treat?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So issues include acceptance. Well, this is not easy to write on. They also include, I'm just going to use IoT or offer. That's supposed to be an or. Sorry, that's terrible handwriting. One of the things I would always do really early on, and in this one it's so obvious, it's barely worth thinking about, but it's always worthwhile just identifying first up who you're acting for and who you have to advise. Particularly when you're doing these as assignment or in exam questions, because sometimes you'll be asked to just provide what the legal issues are. Sometimes you'll be asking to look at it from a particular person's point of view. So starting at that very beginning space is helpful. So a tool that we've spoken about briefly in class is called IRAC. Does anybody remember what IRAC stands for?
Issued, rule, application and conclusion?
Yeah, absolutely. So what is the issue, which is where you started? I think you need to do one more thing, and I think this is advice I've already given you, before you can really understand what the issue is. What is that?
Define some of the issues we're talking about, like, or define the, I don't know.
There's pulling out what the issues are, but in order to do that, you need to identify what the important facts are. And we tend to call them material facts. What are the material facts? So let me just move to, let me do it this way. So what I've done, I'm doing it this way because this is actually the way that I work. So what I'm showing you is supposed to look a little bit like a whiteboard. I don't know if it does or not. But if you're looking at me when I'm speaking, you can see the wall behind me is covered with Post-it notes. And so I don't know if I just particularly like dyed small pieces of paper, but I find Post-it notes are a really good way of thinking about organising these ideas and breaking up the individual facts and issues and then organising them on Post-it notes is a really, really great way of doing it. I'm cognizant of the time, so rather than get too caught up there, I'm going to show you what I've done here, which is just an approach. It's certainly not the only approach, but what I've tried to do is just map out a chronology of what happened just really quickly, as if I were doing it with Post-it notes. So basically, I don't think there's a time here, but at 9 a.m, Susanna sent an email. The facts say it contained an offer to sell a Siamese cat. Little alarm bell goes off on my head here. If a client tells us that they made an offer, a client might not actually know whether they made an offer or it was an invitation to treat or not. Just because it says the word offer in the problem, unless you've got somebody giving you legal advice that it's an offer, I would always take one step back from it and try and think back to what the principles are. So again, what I've done in the other colour down below is I've started to map out what the assumptions that I made were along the way, or that you could make. So that the email, the offer was made in the context of the ownership of the pet store. That it wasn't, they weren't mates, that it was, you know, there's enough information for us to make that kind of assumption. I'm also going to stipulate, because I don't have the email, that the email itself didn't say you must reply by email or you must reply by telephone, or didn't give it, other than saying you must reply as soon as possible, it didn't give any specific time. So why might I stipulate what some of my assumptions are, or articulate them, even if it's only to myself?
I think it can help to identify in greater depth what the actual legal problem is, like this, and even the timeline kind of points towards this concept of lapse, and whether or not there was actually, if it was an offer, whether it had ended by the time Susanna had accepted it.
Yeah, look, absolutely. The thing is, if you're making assumptions along the way, if you assume something and that leads to a particular legal conclusion, then if you're able to articulate the assumption, then you know that if that assumption was wrong, your legal conclusion might be wrong. So it might give you the opportunity then to say, well, what's the first thing I would do as, I said to point it out, forget their name, Zeta, we're acting for Zeta. One of the first things I think we'd be asking is, okay, quick and dirty based on what we've got, I can make some assumptions, but I'd need to see a copy of the email, and I'd be checking for whether it specified how you needed to reply, because the answer to that question could change the scene completely. So if, and you know, her assumption is I have to answer by, well, she's answered by fax. If it's stipulated you must answer by email, we would have a different outcome, because the offer itself can set out the basis on which it's capable of being accepted. It did actually stipulate a reply within 24 hours. Again, we're assuming no particular way of replying, but we don't know. So Zeta doesn't even see this email until 3 hours later. And then it's only some hours after that that she sends a response. So the question for Susanna ultimately is, has she somehow ended up in a contract that she's breached? But we're acting for Zeta, so we're looking for, is there any kind of cause of action that she might have? Any contract that she might be a party to? So it is actually as simple as, is there a contract at all? So Susanna's revoked the offer by email. Now, we were just talking about revocations a minute ago. At what point in time is a revocation communicated? Warning, this might be a trick question.
When it's communicated, like when the communication is received, not executed. So
received, so that the work of, so the way that the principles work is that a communication occurs when it's received. I like to think of this as communication is what the listener does. Like, doesn't matter what you say, it only matters what people hear. So drafting the letter is not good enough. You have to send the letter, and in the case of, even if it's by post, it actually has to be received if it's a revocation. So email, when is an email received?
At the point it's made available at the email server.
At the email server, exactly. So what time was that likely to be?
Very soon after it was sent by Susanna.
probably only microseconds afterwards.
It's not when the recipient opens it.
No, it's not when the recipient opens it. And so that's the trick for young players. Received means capable of receipt.
Ah, yeah.
So another way of thinking of that is if we were sending a letter, it's the point of time where the letter hits your letterbox, not when you take it out of the envelope.
Yeah.
And in the case of email, that is usually only microseconds after it's sent. So what else happens along the way? So I'm going to make this. So Susanna sees this email that's accepting the offer, which in fact she had withdrawn the day before at 8 o'clock on Saturday morning. What, if any, relevance does that have?
A failure lapse at all?
So, well, at this stage, the question would be for Susanna, oh, do I have to send this kitten off to this person instead of the person I sold it to yesterday?
Right.
There could be that question. But really, given that she's revoked it and you've actually addressed that issue in relation to the timing, I don't think this is particularly relevant. The only question is whether or not this was sent before. And actually, if that says email and it's not an email, is it? It's a fax. These are the same document, this one. And it is sent after it was revoked.
Mm.
And then what relevance is there that Zeta only sees the revocation email at 10 a.m.? Very little relevance at all, as I think it was Billy who said just a moment ago that this revocation email was received at the point in time when it was capable of being viewed from the server or taken from the server. So even though she only actually saw it at 10 a.m., in fact, it was sent to her immediately after the sale, sometime around 5 p.m. the day before. So again, this looks like all the scribble, Post-it notes and all the rest of it looks like I've completely overcomplicated, which is a really problem at the end of the day. But it's a good problem for grappling, well, what could each of these steps mean? What relevance do they have? A couple of other issues that are probably could be explored in here. One is whether there was an offer in the first place. And I think that was one of the first ones you came with. We would need more information to find that out, I suspect. Is it a specific email? You know, she knows, the owner of the pet shop knows that Zeta has been looking for a particular type of Siamese kitten for a long time, and it's a specific offer just to her? Or is it, could be some sort of electronic mail? She might send out an email every Saturday morning or every Friday saying these are the pets we're going to have in the pet shop this week. Come and have a look. We don't know. We need more information to find out. Again, another thing that I find quite useful to do is to just map out all of the potential issues, and again, move them on my timeline to see if and where they fit at all, working out which ones are relevant. So I have a collection of potential issues here. Sorry, I'm just trying to move it around. Some of them are things that we're going to attack in a lot more detail over the coming weeks, but some of them are things that you might be able to look at very, very quickly straight away. For example, thinking about whether it's an invitation to treat or not. Frankly, I don't think you've got enough information in this to know, but good students will be saying, I need more information to know this. I'll make an assumption it was an offer because the word offer was used, but I would need this kind of information to check that it was in fact an offer and not an invitation to treat. Because if it's an invitation to treat, it's even less likely that we've got a contract.
Can I just ask a question?
Please, that's what we're here for.
When we're answering it, so we would list each of these questions in a section called issues. That would form part of.
But this kind of thing, these ones where I'm doing the discussion board tasks, I'm saying these are very much like exam questions. And in an exam question, you're going to try and be as clear as you possibly can. You're going to address each of the elements. Address each of the steps. What are the material facts? What do these mean? What assumptions do I need to make? What issues arise here? How would I address them? On the balance of, these are the rules. On the balance of probabilities, I think a court's more likely to say this than that, but I'd need this additional information to know. When you're doing your memorandum, when you're doing an assignment piece, you've got a lot more words and time to play with, and you can be a lot more measured around it. So you can produce it more like a memorandum with an introduction and a conclusion, and you build your story in between. Now, it's never a ridiculous idea to have a kind of checklist. Have I identified the issues? Have I applied the relevant law? Have I reached an appropriate conclusion? In fact, they're the kinds of things that we will be on the marking criteria. So you definitely will be looking at those things. But you'll get more skilled at writing it, so you're not just writing like this. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
Also, with the cases, so would we get something similar like this in an exam? And with the cases that we would use to support our answer, would we be presented with, say, 20 cases that we need to know in order to answer in the exam? Or do we just need to...
No. Short answer is no. Pretty much any of the cases that we talk about along the way or that are in the textbook, you might end up drawing on. This semester's exam is going to be slightly different from all previous semesters. I finally won a fight I've been having for a long time. So one of the things that is always, and I don't want you worried too much about the exam yet, so just take all of this with a bit of a grain of salt at the moment. But one of the things that has always concerned me in exams is it's very difficult to write an exam that allows the really good students to shine. And what ends up happening a lot is I find that everything gets squashed, that for the exam to be reasonable and not ridiculously difficult, so that it's actually reasonable for everybody to pass. And I've got to say, most people pass this subject. But I've had a number of semesters in a row where I've had a lot of credits and not a lot either side of the credits. So some distinctions, very small number of high distinctions. I mean, I think the last 4 semesters I probably had 1 HD each semester, maybe 2 a couple of times. So I would like to see more opportunities for people to shine. So one of the solutions that I have for that is my plan is to give students a fact scenario in advance of the exam. So you will know what the facts are, and you will most likely have a contract to read that you will get in advance. So then the questions will happen in the exam, but you will be able to do a bit of guessing about what kind of areas are likely to be relevant. I wouldn't get your hopes stuck on it too much because they will be necessarily a little bit tricky. But you certainly won't get a case list, and I'm not going to put my hand on my heart and say, you'll only need these 4 cases. Because life doesn't work that way. Sadly, wouldn't it be good if I could have just spent the last 30 years of my career with only 4 cases? Would have been awesome. Is there anything else here that I thought
Kath,
might...
very quick question about the hypothetical. Is there any scope to explore there being an option to exercise acceptance on Zeta's part?
think we could certainly explore it. Let's talk about what would you need for there to be an option.
Wouldn't you need consideration?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the option itself needs to be a contract. So you would need to have agreement that there is an option.
Right.
So agreement along the lines of, I won't sell this cat to anybody other than you for the next 24 hours unless I hear that you don't want it.
Right.
So that would be agreement. Ideally you would be looking for somebody to offer that and for that to be accepted. But we would need the other elements of a contract. So we would need consideration. So for the point of our discussion at the moment, let's call that price. So in exchange for the promise to hold the offer open and not sell the cat to anybody else for a 24-hour period, Zeta would have needed to pay a price for that. Even if it was a very small price, it might have just been, $1, but there needed to be some price. We also needed there to be evidence we need there to be intention and some sort of evidence that the intention was it was a binding promise to hold the offer open. And we would need certainty as to what holding the offer open meant. So we would probably need certainty as to what the price would be if the option was accepted. And also, am I holding it open for 24 hours? 24 hours from when? And of course, both of the parties would need capacity to contract. Again, we're early days now, so I wouldn't be expecting an examination of this, but seeing you've raised it, we would need to know that both Zeta and Susanna had agreed, that they had capacity to contract, that Zeta wasn't some crazy cat lady.
One question.
Yeah, that, everybody's in their right mind, that we need to know that Susanna, in fact, it might be that it's the pet shop is the owner of the cat. Susanna just might be a 14-year-old who works there on Friday afternoons. She may not have either the contractual capacity to enter into a contract or the authority to enter into a contract for the company that she works for. Again, we're making a number of those little assumptions.
Sure.
And that's why it takes us so long at the beginning here, because we're pulling all of those different elements. So I got a good question in the reflection task, effectively saying in tort, you get these different elements. And I know, I need to, if I'm going to prove a tort, then I need to see each of the different elements of the tort. Similarly in crime, do we do that in contract? We don't usually use that language as such, but in a sense, all of the formation elements are elements. So in order for us to have a contract, we need to have agreement. Agreement itself is made up usually of an offer capable of acceptance on its terms, being accepted without variation. We need to have consideration. For the time being, let's call that price. But effectively that means if you make a promise, you get something in return for that promise. Then we need to have intention. That is that each of the parties intended that the agreement they reached would be legally binding on them. And then we need certainty. And certainty means we need to understand exactly what the promises were contained in the offer. We need to make sure that they're actual promises, that they're not illusory, and a range of other things that we will get to.
Kath, I just have a question about that.
Please.
So for this case hypothetical that we've just done, obviously you don't go past the offer and acceptance stage. So
No.
we just cut it off there?
Well, the thing is, if, and I suspect you would, given what we've done here, if you get to the stage where you're not, where we've found that, well, there's quite possibly no offer, but even if there was, that offer was revoked before it was validly accepted, that means that we can't possibly have a contract.
Sure.
So there's no point in going further.
So in, let's say, another hypothetical, there was no consideration. We stop it there as well?
Yeah, absolutely. What you might do, it would be clever to do, is to just identify that you're making it, you've made some assumptions, and that if there are issues with the assumptions, then you might need to explore the other elements in more depth. But again, and this is something I'll talk about when I walk you all through the main assignment, one of the things that makes me sad when I review papers is that often people think, I've got these 4 elements in order to get a contract. And so then what they do is they make a plan and they devote the same number of words in their plan to each of the elements. And like, not all elements are created equal, particularly for a particular problem. And words are like money in assignments, like spend them wisely, because the way that you make the word count is by making every word count. And so if you're just telling me everything that you've regurgitated from the textbook about intention, say in this problem, intention is really not particularly relevant here. You're going to make some assumptions, they might be wrong, but this is a pretty straightforward problem at the end of the day. And if you're concentrating on the right stuff, then you'll find that, yes, recognizing that there are other elements, you don't really need to do much more than that.
And where would the assumptions be placed in the IRAC model?
Well, when you're applying the law, well, I guess a couple of different spots. When you're actually identifying what the issues are, part of the reason why you come to an issue is because of a particular fact, and you might, at that stage, might need to articulate what assumptions you've made in connection with that fact, because if those assumptions are wrong, then a different law might be relevant. Also, when you're applying the law, to the extent that you're doing so based on assumptions that you've made, articulating that. The other thing is, you're asked to advise Zeta here. So it might be that if you're writing to Zeta or sending Zeta an email, one of the things, just think about how would you communicate this to Zeta. And a good lawyer will probably start with, thanks for giving me all that information. These are the things that you've told me. I possibly need some more information about the email itself, but based on what you've told me, clear to be kind, I think there's very little chance that you've got any contractual relationship with Susanna, which means that you probably have no right to get hold of this kitten. And the reason that I think that is blah, 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 I've made these kind of assumptions. If any of these are wrong, we can explore it in more depth. I might need to explore, I don't know, your ongoing relationship. There might be some estoppel here, or there might be something else, I don't know. I'm trying to make up a backstory where Susanna has been bullying Zeta for years with cat pictures. I don't know.
Just a question on
Catherine.
Hi, Aisha. Yeah, go ahead, and then.
Yes. So in this Zeta's problem, when it says reply to me by 24 hours, do you mean that 24 hours cannot be an option when she keeps the offer unopened?
I think based on the
we didn't
analysis we just
the option,
did, I don't think it gets there. I think it's worth, as I said before, yes, I think it's worth exploring. But was it a binding promise to hold an offer open for 24 hours? I think for the reasons that we explored, it falls short of that.
Okay.
Steph.
Yeah, I was just wondering about if we could talk a little bit about estoppel if we've got some time. So if we just create a context where Susanna said, I will give it to you, and then we have this case where she doesn't, is that a case of estoppel?
Good question. And actually I've noticed, I'm finally looking at the chat, and somebody else has asked me a question about estoppel as well. We will talk about estoppel in class as we get there. For now, I'm going to hold you back from worrying too much about estoppel at this stage. So estoppel is a form of equitable remedy. In intro, you would have at some point spoken about the separation of the common law and the equity courts. I actually did my law degree in New South Wales, where the courts only separated in 1972, where for the rest of the country, we've had separation of equity and common law divisions since the 1870s from memory. So I think equity tends to be something that, even though I'm not a litigator, that I notice myself think about more than most lawyers in Victoria that I've dealt with. And I do wonder sometimes if it's a training thing. What equity is doing is stopping a person or a party to an action from exercising a legal right if it would be unfair to exercise that legal right as a consequence of something that they had done. So as a general rule, saying, I'll keep the offer open for 24 hours and then failing to do that, that's probably bad for her reputation. It's seen as being a bad sport, but the law is pretty clear that unless you have made a binding promise that you have been paid for to keep an offer open, there is no real recourse there. However, if she'd done something more than that, so for example, if the facts were that she said, I will hold that offer open for you for 24 hours, and Zita said, oh, I'm studying law, I know all about options, let me pay you $1 for that promise. And she said, no, don't worry about that, you can trust me. So had basically got out of creating an agreement, then an estoppel might arise. So we'll look at a couple of cases, for example, where a party genuinely believed that they breached a contract and the other party basically took the benefit of their understanding that they had breached that contract, and then subsequently it was clear that there was no contract and that the second party knew that all along. A court would stop that second party from claiming that there was no contract because they knowingly accepted the benefit of the other party believing there was a contract and believing that they had breached it. So it gets a little bit tricky, and right now it's really tempting to get deep in the detail of it, but I'd really like you to just stay a little bit high level for a week or so, and really make sure that you understand the core principles before we test them. So a couple of questions that come up on the side, because we're now at 7:40 and I need to feed some hungry boys or it'll get ugly here, let me tell you. One of the question that keeps coming up is, when are you going to get the question? When's it going to be released? It will be released this week, most likely on Tuesday. I want to make sure that I have one more class with you when there isn't when you're paying attention to the bigger picture and not just to the assignment at hand. So I will most likely release that on Tuesday. I haven't written it yet, that's why I'm saying most likely, but. In fact, now's your opportunity. If anybody has, I like to give you the opportunity to give me a challenge and give me some characters. So any particular pop culture reference that you would like me to steal characters from? I've been watching American Gods. I thought I might pull something from there. No? Really?
Maybe Egg Boy.
Egg Boy. Okay. Yeah, actually, no, that I can do that. Egg boy, definitely. Thank you. Yes. Unfortunately, that means I might need to move Fraser Anning to Victoria, and that'll be your fault.
No, I'm sorry, guys.
Because otherwise, I'm particularly on your first assignment, I can't have a multi-jurisdictional problem. I think otherwise that will be problematic for us all.
That's fair.
All right, so guys, keep working hard. Please have a go at the quizzes, have a go at sharing information about what you're doing, because I can bring that into my own preparation and what's confusing you. I know it feels confusing at the moment, but you will get there. This is not the first time that I've seen confused first years. I don't confuse you on purpose, but that's just how it starts, and you'll know a lot by the end, I promise. Okay. Any other questions? Have a good Sunday night, and for those of you who are face-to-face or just like to come to class anyway, I will see you in class tomorrow. Take care.
Thanks, Kat.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.